The advertisement had been folded into thirds and tucked behind the sugar tin on the kitchen shelf of the rooming house in Medicine Hat, where she had been staying since the end of August. The woman who ran the house, a Mrs. Garneau, had clipped it from the territorial advance without being asked and left it there the way people leave things they think you need, but won't say so directly. She found it on a Thursday morning when she was measuring out the last of her tea. She read it once standing at the shelf, then took it to the window where the light was better. It said a man named Prescott needed a capable woman for a working arrangement on a property outside of Bircham, approximately 40 miles northeast. The work would be steady. The property was a grain operation. Though he used the word farm, the way men use it when they mean something larger than the word suggests, but don't want to oversell it. He was looking for someone not afraid of cold weather or difficult seasons. He had written the thing himself. She could tell the punctuation was careful and there were no flourishes. He'd written arrangement twice, once at the beginning and once at the end, as if he wanted to be sure the word landed correctly both times. She set it on the windowsill and looked out at the street. The poplar trees along the avenue had gone to their autumn color, and the air off the prairie smelled like turned earth, and something colder behind it, coming. She had been in Medicine Hat since September, and before that in Calgary for 3 months, and before that she did not especially want to account for. She was 32 years old. She had learned things in the past 4 years that she had not expected to learn, and had come out the other side of them quieter than she went in, which she did not think of as damage, only as adjustment. She wrote back the same afternoon. He replied in 6 days, which she took to mean he had other letters to consider and had considered them. His reply was shorter than his advertisement. He would meet her at the Bircham station on the 21st if that suited. He did not ask if she had questions. She supposed he figured she'd either come or she wouldn't. She came. The station at Bircham was smaller than the one in Medicine Hat and smelled like green lumber, which meant it was new, which meant the town was still deciding what it was going to be. She was the only passenger who stepped off. The platform was empty, except for a man standing at the far end near the freight doors, watching the train with his hands in his jacket pockets. He was tall and stood the way men stand when they are used to standing in open country, without leaning on anything, just upright and settled. He did not move toward her immediately. He waited until the conductor had handed down her trunk and the train had closed itself up again before he came along the platform. He said, "You'd be the woman who wrote from Medicine Hat." She said she was. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have been picturing from a letter and are now adjusting to the actual thing. Not unfriendly, analytical. She did the same to him. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a little less. There was gray at his temples, and he had the kind of face that weather had worked on steadily and without apology. His eyes were a particular shade of brown that had gone almost amber where the light caught them. He picked up her trunk before she could move toward it herself, not to be chivalrous, she thought, but because it was there and needed moving, and he was already closer to it. He said, "The road out is rough this time of year. Takes about an hour and a half." She said that was fine. He did not make small talk on the drive out, neither did she. The road ran northeast through flat country that opened wider than anything she had seen in a while. The sky sitting on all sides of them like something deliberate, like a decision the land had made about proportion. The fields they passed were mostly harvested, pale stubble in long rows under the October light. Some of it was his, she discovered later. Not all of it. She watched the land and tried to read it. The soil along the roadside was dark, and she took that as a good sign. But the ditches were dry in the way ditches get when the autumn has come in without rain behind it. And there were sections where the topsoil had a particular gray cast that she associated with wind erosion. Not catastrophic, but ongoing. She stored that. He pulled the wagon up a low rise, and there it was below them. A farmhouse, a large barn, a granary, 2 smaller outbuildings she couldn't identify from the distance. A windmill at the back. Fields on 3 sides, the 4th given over to a stand of spruce that broke the skyline to the north. The house was wood-framed and painted, which surprised her. The paint was not new, but it had been maintained, which told her something. She said, "The barn's bigger than I expected." He said, "It was bigger than I expected when I built it." You plan for what you think you'll have. She didn't answer that. They came down off the rise and into the yard. A dog came out from behind the granary, black and white, with one ear that didn't match the other. It looked at her without barking, assessed her for about 4 seconds, and then went and sat beside the man's left boot. She watched that. He said, "That's Cutter. He decides quickly." She said, "So do I." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, she filed it away. The farmhand came out of the barn about then. A young man, maybe 20, with the loose-limbed walk of someone still growing into his own height. He said his name was Avery, and he held out his hand in the serious way of a young person, trying to make a good impression on someone they haven't been told to impress. She shook it. His grip was honest. She looked at the house, the barn, Avery, the dog, and then back at the man standing beside the wagon with his hand resting on the traces. She said, "You mentioned in your letter that the operation was grain." He said, "Wheat, mainly, some oats. I've been trying barley in the north section for 2 years." She said, "How's the barley?" He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "The barley's been a lesson." She nodded. She understood the particular flatness with which a person says something has been a lesson. It meant the lesson had been expensive. He showed her the house. The kitchen was large and practical and had a wood stove that was better than she'd expected and a window over the sink that faced west. The room she would have was off the back of the kitchen, with its own door to the yard, a cot, a shelf, a window that faced southeast. The southeast window meant she would have morning light, and she filed that as something she had not expected to get. He said, "There's a woman in town who comes Thursday afternoons, Estelle. She's been managing the house some since last spring. She'll keep coming if that suits you or not, depending." She said, "What happened last spring?" He said, "My sister was here. Then she wasn't." He said it cleanly and without asking for a response, and so she didn't offer one. She moved in that evening. She unpacked the way she always unpacked. Coat on the hook first, then the practical things arranged where she could reach them without looking. Her knife on the windowsill, her small oilskin of herbs on the shelf. The book she had been carrying for 2 months without opening went spine out at the back of the shelf, which was where she put things she wasn't ready for. She made supper because the fire needed to be lit regardless, and the food needed making. She found a ham hock and some dried beans, and there was bread from 2 days ago that was still good if you toasted it. She had it on the table. By the time he came in from the barn with Avery behind him, they both stopped in the doorway and looked at the table. Avery said, "There's beans," she said. "They've been soaking since this afternoon. They take time." He sat down at the table. She put the food out and they ate, and she listened to the particular silence of 2 people who were used to eating together and had gotten economical about it. It was not the silence of people who had run out of things to say. It was more like a river that had found its banks and stopped needing to push. She ate at the other end of the table and did not try to fill the quiet. She had learned that filling quiet is a nervous habit, and she had mostly broken it. After supper, Avery said the beans were better than what they'd had in a while, and meant it in the specific way young people mean things when they forget to perform appreciation. She said she'd found the hawk behind the flour sack. He looked at the man, and the man said something under his breath that was not quite a smile either. She washed up while they went out to check on something in the barn. The window above the basin was dark by then, and she could see the reflection of the kitchen behind her, the lamp on the table, the chair he had pushed back at an angle when he stood. She noted that he had pushed it back and not in. She noted this only because she noted things. She did not make it mean anything. She slept well in the room with the southeast window. She could hear the windmill turning slowly in the night, a small regular sound like something keeping time. She was up before light. She had the stove laid and the coffee on and had gone out to break the ice on the water pails before he came in. He stopped again in the doorway. She was beginning to understand. He stopped in doorways the way some people pause at thresholds, not from hesitation, from the habit of reading a room before entering it. She recognized the habit. She had it herself. He said, "You don't have to start this early," she said. "The fire needs laying regardless." He poured himself coffee without asking if she minded and stood at the window and looked out at the yard the way a person looks at a thing they are responsible for that is not entirely in their control. The sky was the color of old pewter. and the fields were still dark, just the pale stubble lines catching the first gray light. She said, "How many acres in the north section?" He says, 80. She said, "And that's where the barley's been." He said, "That's where." She said, "Can I ride it this morning?" He turned from the window and looked at her, not as if the question surprised him, exactly, as if he was deciding how to take it. He said, "You ride?" She said, "Yes." He put his cup down and went to get the horses. The north section was 40 minutes out. They rode in the early cold without talking, her breath and the mare's breath making the same pale clouds. The land went flat in every direction and the sky pressed down close, not threatening, just present, the way prairie sky is present, like a conversation you can't entirely ignore. The north section was clearly different from the south fields. She could see it before they reached the fence line. The color was wrong. In the south, the stubble was pale gold, the ordinary color of harvested wheat. Out here, the ground was darker and lower, and had a flatness to it that spoke of poor drainage. In the depressions between the rows, she could see the stain of standing water that had frozen and thawed and frozen again. She pulled up at the fence. He stopped beside her. She noticed he did not speak while she looked. He had that quality she was beginning to understand, of being patient with observation, of letting a person look without filling the space. She said, "What did the barley do the first year?" He said, "Came in thin, lost about a third before harvest," she said. "Second year," he said, "worse, lost half. The stalks kept going down in the south end of the field. I thought it was the seed." She said, "It's not the seed." She dismounted and walked to the fence and crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the soil just beyond the post. It was cold and gave about an inch before it stopped, and what came up on her fingers was dark, but with a grayish tinge, the particular color of soil that sat in water too long. She stood and looked out at the north section for another moment. She said, "Where does the water go when you get a hard rain?" He said, "Sits for a while, then dries out." She said, "Does it run anywhere or just sit?" He thought about it. He said, "There's a low spot in the northeast corner, stays wet longest." She looked northeast. The land gave no sign of it from here. She said, "Can we ride the perimeter?" They rode the north section for the better part of an hour. She did not talk while she looked. He did not push her to. She noted where the ground changed color, where the frost had buckled the surface differently, where the drainage ran naturally, and where it stopped. At the northeast corner, he had been right. There was a low area, perhaps half an acre, where the soil was darker still, and the frost had heaved the ground in the circular pattern that meant water was sitting below the surface even now. She stopped her horse at the edge of it. He pulled up beside her. She said, "Has anyone ever put a ditch through here?" He said, "There was one years ago, my father's time, filled in." She said, "Filled in how?" He said, "Silted in, probably. I don't know exactly. It wasn't much of a ditch to begin with." She looked at the depression. Then she turned and looked back at the south fence line, estimating the grade. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The north section ran downhill very gently from south to north, which meant water came in from the high ground and had nowhere to go. She said, "If you put a ditch along the north fence line and ran it to the low corner, everything in this section would drain." He was quiet. She said, "I'm not asking what it would cost. I'm asking if the grade would carry it." He looked at the ground the way a man looks at a thing he has been not looking at for a long time. He said, "My father always said the grade was there." She turned her horse and looked at the northeast corner again. The low spot, the heaved frost, ghost of a ditch that someone had started and let go. Someone had seen it before, just hadn't finished it. She said, "This is a 2-week job with 2 people." He didn't answer right away. He sat his horse and looked at the north section with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Not hopeless. Something past hopeless on the other side of it, where a person has decided a thing cannot be done and has gotten so used to that decision that reconsidering it feels like grief. She gave him the time. Finally, he said, "The soil over here, it's different from the south. My father always said so. Better if you could keep it from sitting." She said, "It's better. That's why it hurts more to lose it." He looked at her then, not with the analytical look he'd used at the station, with something else, more direct, less managed. He picked up his reins. He said they should get back before the temperature dropped again. They started on the ditch the following Monday. Avery took the south fence line while she and the man worked the north edge, her with the spade and him following behind with the broader blade to widen what she cut. The ground was hard but not frozen through, and once they got below the top crust it moved well. She had been right about the grade. It was slight, less than she had hoped, but it was there. They worked through the cold without much talking. Their breath came in long clouds. The dog, Cutter, came out the first day and watched them for 20 minutes with his mismatched ears angled forward, then apparently decided the work was not interesting enough and went back to the granary. Avery was a good worker. She noticed this. He did not need to be told the same thing twice. And he did not complain about the cold, and when he hit a section of heavier gravel, he went and got a different tool without being asked. She filed this about him. A good young worker is the kind of thing you note. By Wednesday, they had the main line cut. She spent Thursday probing the northeast corner to find the natural low point, walking the edge of the depression in her boots while the frost worked up through the soles, pushing the handle of the spade ahead of her to check the grade. He watched from the fence line for a while. Then he came and walked it with her. He said, "You do that like you've done it before," she said. "I grew up on a mixed farm in Manitoba. We had drainage problems in the East Quarter every spring." He said, "Where in Manitoba?" She said, "Near Morden, my father's place." He nodded. He did not ask what had brought her to Medicine Hat, or what had happened between Manitoba and now. She was grateful for that. She had answered that question before in the forced and careful way of a person who has decided what to say and has made peace with saying it. But she did not enjoy answering it. On Friday, they broke through to something. She had been working the east side of the depression, cutting down toward where she believed the outlet should run, and then the spade went through differently. Not flat resistance, but a hollow give, the blade sinking faster than the ground around it. She stopped. She cleared the surface with her hands. There was a gap small, the size of her fist, and below it a channel, old, choked with 50 years of silt and decomposed root material, but a channel. Someone had been here before. Someone had dug this and left it. She said, "Come look at this." He came and crouched beside her and looked at the gap. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "My father always said there was a ditch out here from before his time. I thought he was remembering it wrong." She said, "He wasn't." They worked the rest of the afternoon with their hands as much as the spades, clearing the old channel foot by foot. Avery came over and joined them without being asked. The three of them worked in the particular silence of people uncovering something that was there before they arrived, which is a different silence from the silence of building. By late afternoon, water was moving. A thin line of it, gray-brown with silt, running along the bottom of the new ditch toward the east fence. Not much, but moving. She stood at the edge of the ditch with mud on her sleeves to the elbow and watched it. He stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. Avery said, "Does that fix it?" She said, "It's a start. We'll know better in the spring." But she already knew. She could see it in the grade, in the way the water moved without hesitation, as if it had been waiting for someone to show it the way. The north section would drain. The barley would go in dry. The yield would not fix everything in a single season, but it would be enough to show them what the land could do. That night, she made supper, and he set the table, and Avery fed the dog without being asked. The three of them ate, and the silence was a different shape than it had been the first week, less like a thing that needed filling, and more like a room they had all gotten comfortable in. After supper, he poured coffee for both of them, and left hers on the counter near the stove without saying anything. She picked it up. Outside, the temperature had dropped, and the windmill had gone still. Through the window, she could see the first stars coming on over the east fields. She said, "What did you plan to do with the north section?" "Before the barley," he said, "my father ran beef cattle out there before he sold the herd." She said, "What year?" 78. Year I came back from the Northwest. She didn't ask what the Northwest meant. She understood what years and directions meant in a certain context. He picked up his cup. He said, "He always said the north section was the best land he had. I think that's why it bothered me. Losing the worst land is just what happens. Losing the best land is a different thing." She wrapped her hands around her cup. She said, "It's not lost, it was waiting on water." He looked at her. He did not smile exactly, but something in his face settled in the way faces settle when something has been said correctly. She went back to the stove. She was in the habit by then of walking the fields in the early morning before either of them came in, not the whole property. The section nearest the house, the windmill, the granary, the north fence. She moved through the cold with Cutter sometimes at her heel and sometimes ranging ahead, deciding what was interesting. She used the time to look at things she didn't have time to look at during the day. A fence post that had shifted, a hinge on the granary door that was starting to work loose, ice on the water trough, and what it told her about how cold the night had been. She did not report these things. She fixed what she could fix and noted what she couldn't. He found her fixing the granary hinge one morning in November, a Thursday. She had the door propped open and was working the pin back into alignment with a flat stone and the heel of her palm. He stood in the yard and watched her for a moment. He said, "I was going to get to that." She said, "It was working loose." He came and looked at what she had done. He didn't say anything else about it. He went in for coffee. She finished the hinge and came in after and poured her own cup. The woman named Estelle came on Thursday afternoons, as he had said. She was perhaps 50, with a practical manner and a way of moving through the kitchen that said she had her own opinions about where things belonged. She and Estelle reached an understanding by the second week without discussing it. Estelle handled the laundry and the floors. She handled the cooking and the provisioning. They stayed out of each other's way without being unfriendly. Estelle said once, in November, while they were both at the table with the mending, "He doesn't say much." She said, "No." Estelle said, "He didn't say much before, either. Some people are just built that way." She agreed that some people were. Estelle said, "He's a fair man, not easy, but fair." She thought that was an accurate description of him. She filed it beside the other accurate things she had observed. Winter came in properly in December, the way prairie winter comes, without consultation and without apology. The temperatures dropped to things she had not felt since Manitoba, and the wind came off the open fields and found every gap in the siding of the house. She filled the gaps she could find with the wicking she kept in her kit. He found her at the north wall one morning, on her knees, with the wicking and a knife, and did not say anything, just went and got his own tools and started on the east side. They chinked the house in 2 hours, working around the perimeter, her taking the lower sections and him the higher, handing materials back and forth as needed without a system they had discussed. She noticed that they had developed by then a way of working around each other that did not require negotiation. She would start something, and he would see what was needed and move to the complementary position. Or he would begin, and she would assess and fill in what the task required. It was the kind of efficiency that either comes from long familiarity or from two people who think about a problem in the same way. She did not name this. She only noted it. The first real blizzard came in January. She had been tracking the barometric pressure for 2 days by the way the dog behaved, Cutter circling and restless and moving close to the house by mid-afternoon, which she had learned was more reliable than the sky. She told him the night before that they should move the horses and the last of the cattle into the barn before morning. He looked at her. He said, "What are you reading?" She said, "The dog." He went out that evening and moved everything in. The storm came before dawn. She lay in her room and listened to it build, the wind finding the eaves, the windmill locking into its break with a sound like a door slamming once. She was not afraid of it. Prairie storms were not worse than the ones she had grown up in. They were just bigger. In the morning, when the wind had dropped enough to see, he came in from the barn with ice in his eyebrows and said everything was fine and poured himself coffee and said, "The dog knew." She said, "Dogs usually do." He sat at the table. She watched him, not directly, the way she watched most things, from an angle through some other task. He said, "My wife used to watch the barometer, had one on the wall in the back kitchen. I took it down after." She waited. He said, 3 years ago, February. He did not say more than that. He said it in the same clean, flat way that he said things he had been carrying a long time, not asking for anything. She understood that way of speaking. She used it herself. She said, "I'm sorry." He nodded once. She refilled his cup. She had been on the farm 4 months by then, and she had been on the ledger books for 6 weeks. And it was clear to her what the situation was and what it was not. The wheat had done well. The oats were adequate. The barley had been the lesson his 2 seasons of loss had made it. But if the drainage held through the spring thaw, the lesson would be finished. She could see a shape to the thing that was different from what she had seen in October. Not easy, but not impossible. She told him this in February at the table, with the ledger open between them. She had not been asked to review the books with him. She had not asked permission either. She had simply started keeping them accurately and had laid them on the table one evening. And he had come and looked and sat down, and they had gone through the numbers. He said, "You do this like you've done it before." She said, "I kept my father's books from the time I was 16. He said, "And after?" She said, "And after?" Yes. He didn't ask her to say more. She didn't. They sat at the table for an hour and a half that evening, going through the numbers for the year past and the projections for the year coming. She had written out a column for the north section, what it had cost, what it would need to repay itself, at what yield, and at what price. He looked at the column for a long time without speaking. He said, "You think it'll come back." She said, "I think the land was never the problem. The drainage was the problem. The land will do what it was going to do once the water goes where it should." He looked at her over the ledger. She met his eye. She was not in the habit of looking away first. He said, "I have to go into Bircham next week for the seed order. If you had a list of what you need for the house, I could take it." She said she would make a list. He said, "If you wanted to come, there's room." She said that would be useful. She could speak to Estelle's cousin, who had the dry goods. She'd been meaning to price out the wicking. He said, "All right then." That was all. But she noted it. She noted the particular quietness with which he had offered it, as if it were a practical matter, which it partly was, and as if it were something else as well, which it partly was. She went to bed and lay in the room with the southeast window and listened to the prairie outside, the enormous quiet of a winter night on open land, the snow packed down and still, the windmill not moving. She was 32 years old. She had come here with a canvas bag and a sewing kit and a set of knives and had expected to manage. She had not expected the north section. She had not expected the old channel underground, the ghost of someone's earlier work, uncovered and continued. She had not expected to feel the particular satisfaction of a problem that turned out to be solvable. She had not expected the window that faced southeast. She was not unhappy. She turned this over the way she turned things over, without sentiment, just to look at it clearly. She was not unhappy, and that was not nothing. She had been unhappy for a period that she did not calculate anymore, because the calculation had become beside the point. She knew what it had felt like, and she knew what this felt like, and they were not the same thing. She pulled the quilt to her shoulder and watched the pale square of the window and the thin line of stars visible above the spruce line. She thought about the list for Bircham. She thought about the north section in April, the thaw coming, the ditch running clear, the soil opening up under the first real warmth. She thought about Cutter on the step in the morning, ear cocked for her boots on the floor. She stopped thinking and slept. The spring came slow and then fast the way it does in that country. The thaw set in seriously in March, and by the end of the first week the ditches were running, and she put on her boots before light and went out to check the north section. He was already there. He had been out since before dawn, he said, and he said it the way he said most things, as a fact without performance. The ditch was running. She stood at the north fence and watched the water moving along the line they had cut, brown with silt and snowmelt, running strong toward the east corner and away. The low spot in the northeast was draining. She could see it from here. The depression that had held water for decades was emptying into the channel. The ground around it darkening and contracting the way ground does when something that has been sitting too long finally lets go. He stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. She said, "The grade is better than I thought." He said, "My father was right about this land." She said he was. Avery came down from the house with coffee in 2 cups and handed them over the fence without comment and went back to the barn. She watched him go. She had grown accustomed to him. He had grown accustomed to her. This was something she had not expected to find here, people she was growing accustomed to, and who were growing accustomed to her in return. The barley went in April, the whole 80 acres. He hired 2 men from Bircham for the seeding, brothers named Dawes, who knew their work and kept to themselves, and were gone by the end of the week. She managed the provisions and the schedule and kept the ledger current and rode the north section every 2 days to watch what the ground was doing. It was doing what she had said it would do. By June, the north section was a different field. The barley came up even and strong, the color of it in the early morning a green that belonged to the soil rather than being imposed on it. She rode it once and stopped her horse at the middle of the field and sat there for a while, just looking. He came up beside her. She said, "Your father was right about the soil." He said it was the best on the property. She said, "He wasn't wrong." He looked out at the barley. Then he looked at her, and she let him look, and the field went on in every direction, green and level, and doing what it had always had in it to do, given the right conditions, given enough time. That summer, the Bircham Territorial Advance ran a piece about farm operations in the district. It mentioned the property. It got most of the numbers right. It called her the housekeeper, which was not inaccurate, but was not quite right either. She read it at the kitchen table, and then set it down and went out to check the granary hinge she had been monitoring. When she came back in, he was reading it. He set it down when she came through the door. He said, "They got the acreage wrong." She said, "I know." He said, "And the housekeeper." She said, "I know." He held her eye for a moment. She held his. Then he set the paper on the corner of the table and went to wash up for supper. She took the paper and wrote the correction to the acreage in pencil in the margin. Under the word housekeeper, she drew a short horizontal line, the kind that means incorrect, see revision, and left it there on the table between where they would both sit. He found it before supper and looked at it and put it in the front cover of the ledger between the pages where she tracked the seasons. He did not comment on it. She did not expect him to. She started the stove for supper. He came and set the table without being asked, which he had begun doing in April without either of them noting it. Avery came in and fed the dog. Outside the evening was long and pale, the prairie light that stays too late in summer, the sky a color that has no exact name. She said, "Cutter was watching the north pasture this afternoon." He said, "I saw that." She said, "Something worth watching, or just habit." He said, "With that dog, it's hard to know." She said, "Yes." They ate. The food was what it was, the silence what it had become. After supper, he sat with the ledger, and she sat with the mending, and outside the last light stayed long on the fields, on the barley that was nearly ready, on the north section that had found its water, on the ditch that ran clear and steady toward the fence corner, doing quietly what it had been built to do. The second chair appeared on the porch in August, placed beside the first one, both facing east toward where the light came first. She did not remark on it. She sat in it that evening, and he sat in the other, and they watched the light go long and gold across the prairie, across the fields that were his, and were also something she had made her hands a part of, across the open country that went on past where you could see, flat and wide and patient, kind of land that rewards people who understand how to wait. The windmill turned slowly. Cutter put his chin on her boot and stayed there until dark.